UFOs involve more than you or any other civilian can realise. They're the most important thing and perhaps the greatest threat that mankind has ever faced. Our brief was simply to blow the hangar, a clean-up hop after the experiment. Then they found the footage. Civilians on a merry with detectors filming themselves. And that was my proof, my way to get justice for the ones I lost from my team.
December 1980, a cold night in Rendlesham Forest, Suffolk. US Air Force patrols from RAF Woodbridge spot strange lights between the trees, red, blue, white, moving like they're alive. Sergeant Jim Penniston approaches and finds a black, triangular craft hovering above the ground. Its surface glows with strange symbols warm to the touch. A blinding flash erupts, and the object vanishes, leaving 3 perfect impressions in the frozen soil and radiation 10 times higher than normal. The next night, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt leads an investigation. His recorder captures the moment beams of light descend from the sky. It's moving. It's coming this way. The lights respond intelligently, watching, measuring, almost communicating, then silence. The forest returns to stillness, but the men are changed forever. Official reports call it unexplained lights. The Ministry of Defense denies significance. Yet for those who saw it, it was real, physical, intelligent, unforgettable. 4 decades later, the question remains: what landed in Rendlesham Forest that night? And is it still watching? December 26, 1980, 03 hours. The icy winds swept through the dense pines of Rendlesham Forest, Suffolk, England. The moon hung low, veiled behind drifting clouds, and the air carried that peculiar stillness that settles before something extraordinary happens. Airman First Class John Burroughs adjusted his rifle strap and stamped his boots against the frozen soil. He was part of the 81st Security Police Squadron stationed at RAF Woodbridge, one of 2 US Air Force bases leased from the Royal Air Force during the Cold War. This was routine patrol duty, or so he thought. The first transmission came over the radio, faint, uncertain. Patrol to East Gate. We have strange lights in the forest, descending. Can you confirm aircraft movements? Static. Then silence. Sergeant Jim Penniston, 26 years old, veteran of security operations, tightened his gloves and squinted toward the tree line. Through the gaps in the forest, a strange orange-red glow pulsed rhythmically, almost breathing. It's probably a crash, he muttered to himself. A local aircraft downed, maybe one of the RAF's training planes. The thought steadied him. But as the light shifted, hovering, weaving through the trees, that rational comfort dissolved. He and 2 others, Burroughs and Airman Edward Cabansag, moved cautiously down the dirt track into the forest. The crunch of their boots sounded deafening in the silence. Every step forward made the light appear brighter, more deliberate. Penniston stopped and whispered, "Kill the flashlights." The forest turned to shadow. Ahead, the light hovered, metallic, structured, glowing from within. Penniston would later recall in sworn statements what he saw that night: a black, triangular craft approximately 3 meters across, resting on tripod-like legs. Its surface, smooth and reflective like obsidian, shimmered faintly even in the darkness. Symbols, he described them as glyphs, not letters, were etched along its hull, glowing faintly. He reached out, hand trembling, and touched the surface. It felt like glass, but warm, he later told investigators. Behind him, Burroughs' breathing grew shallow. "Jim, what is that?" he whispered. The radio crackled again, faint voices from the base control tower confirming. No aircraft lost, no radar anomalies. Yet here it was, a machine that defied explanation. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it rose silently above the trees, emitted a blinding flash and vanished into the night sky. The 3 airmen stood in disbelief. Penniston's eyes watered from the light. Burroughs clutched his helmet. For nearly an hour they searched the clearing, finding nothing but 3 triangular impressions pressed into the frozen soil, perfect, measured, equidistant. Trees nearby bore scorch marks. The air smelled faintly of ozone and burnt sap. They radioed back to command, but no one on the other end seemed willing to believe what they'd seen. By dawn, word had spread quietly across RAF Woodbridge. Some laughed it off. Too much whiskey, one sergeant joked in the mess. Others whispered uneasily about nuclear storage bunkers deep beneath the base. Britain's eastern coast was a nerve point in NATO's defense network. Any unexplained aerial activity was a matter of grave concern. Penniston filed an incident report, clinical in tone yet unmistakably shaken. He noted the color shifts: blue, red, amber, the craft's lack of sound, the static electricity in the air. His superior officers sealed the report and instructed him to leave it be. But the forest itself refused to stay silent. The following night, new witnesses reported more lights. This time they seemed to dart between the trees like intelligent orbs, glowing red and blue. Animals in a nearby farm erupted into chaos, dogs barking, cattle thrashing against fences. Airmen on patrol described the lights as tracking them, moving deliberately in formation. For those men trained to assess threats with precision, it was something deeply unsettling. To the locals, Rendlesham Forest had always carried its share of folklore: whispers of ghost lights, wartime aircraft crashes, strange echoes among the trees. But what happened that night was different. It was documented, measured, recorded by soldiers bound to truth and duty. The official response was immediate, but calculated. The British Ministry of Defence received a report labelled "Unexplained Lights." The phrasing was careful, neutral, bureaucratic. It described 3 depressions in the ground, higher than normal radiation readings, and sighting of luminous phenomena. Yet even stripped of emotion, the details painted a chilling picture. As Penniston walked the site again at sunrise, frost coating every surface, he could still trace the faint outline of those triangular impressions. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, a habit from years in the field, and sketched the symbols he remembered from the craft's hull. "They burned into my mind," he would later confess. For decades afterward, skeptics would propose explanations: a nearby lighthouse, a meteor shower, even the glow of distant Orford Ness beacon. But none of those accounts matched the physical evidence that morning. The impressions, the radiation, the silence. Back at the base, Burroughs sat alone in the break room, helmet on the table, staring at nothing. "We're not trained for this," he murmured. The line between duty and disbelief blurred that night, and for many involved, it never returned to normal. It would later be called Britain's Roswell. But on that cold December night, it wasn't a legend. It was 3 frightened men deep in the forest, face to face with something they could not classify, could not explain, and would never forget. Rendlesham wasn't just another UFO sighting. It was the moment when trained professionals, armed with discipline, procedure, and skepticism, stood before the unknown. And for a brief instant, all the structures of reason they'd built collapsed under a single, silent light in the trees. The morning of December 26, 1980, came cold and grey over Suffolk, the kind of winter dawn that seems to hang suspended between night and day. Frost clung to every blade of grass in Rendlesham Forest, a thin mist creeping low across the ground. As the first light broke through the canopy, a small team of U.S. Air Force security personnel stepped quietly into the clearing where, only hours before, strange lights had burned through the night sky. Sergeant Jim Penniston led the group, his expression carved in concentration. He had barely slept since his encounter the night before, and every sound and every rustle of the wind through the pine branches made his pulse tighten. Following him were Airman First Class John Burroughs and several British law enforcement officers invited to observe the site. It was now a matter of official record. The question was simple: what had landed here? The clearing lay ahead like an open wound in the forest. The soil was blackened in 3 precise spots, triangular in formation, as though something heavy had rested there, not crashed, not skidded, but landed. Each indentation measured about 1.5 inches deep, pressed sharply into the earth. Burroughs crouched and touched the ground with his gloved hand. "Still warm," he murmured. Nearby, the bark on several trees bore a dark sheen, scorched patches where the resin had boiled under sudden heat. The smell was faint but distinctive, a mix of ozone and something metallic like overheated wiring. Penniston's eyes scanned the trees, his mind ticking through possibilities. A helicopter flare? A secret exercise? But no aircraft, no training schedule, no radar record matched the time or location. A radiation detector, borrowed from the base's disaster preparedness unit, crackled softly as it swept across the soil. The reading spiked briefly, about 0.07 milliroentgens, small but above the local background average. The air otherwise still carried a faint static hum, as if electricity lingered invisibly in the atmosphere. Penniston dictated the findings into his notepad. 3 depressions, each approximately 1.5 inches deep, spaced equally in a triangle, roughly 9 feet apart. Burn marks on nearby trees 15 feet above ground. Elevated radiation levels unexplained. Behind him, one of the British constables, a man named Ted Collins, whispered to another, "Looks like a tripod landing gear." The words hung in the air like a challenge. At the base headquarters later that morning, an emergency meeting was held between the US Air Force Security Commander, the base duty officer, and representatives from the RAF. The incident was already being called the East Gate Lights. Officially, the goal was containment, to document, classify, and file. Nothing more. The Cold War atmosphere of secrecy ensured that anything unexplained near an American airbase, particularly one suspected of housing nuclear weapons, had to be handled with utmost discretion. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lester Halt, Deputy Base Commander at RAF Woodbridge, listened carefully as Penniston gave his statement. The sergeant's tone was calm, precise, military, but there was something in his eyes, something shaken. Halt made notes of his own, his pen moving in neat, deliberate strokes. "You're certain it was no aircraft?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Penniston replied. "No sound, no rotor wash, no lights consistent with aircraft markings. It was structured, metallic, controlled." "Controlled," Halt repeated softly, then glanced up. "By what?" Penniston had no answer. Outside the window, the morning sun broke weakly through the fog, lighting the runways of RAF Woodbridge. Somewhere beyond the tree line lay the evidence, the indentations, the radiation, the scorched bark. Facts that didn't fit. By midday, word had filtered quietly among personnel in the barracks. Some dismissed it outright. "UFO nonsense," one technician laughed, but others remembered the strange radio interference that night, the flicker on the radar screens, the static that disrupted their comms for almost half an hour. "Coincidence," the officers said. "It's nothing." Still, the US Air Force's official machinery had been set in motion. Within days, a memorandum would be drafted for transmission to the British Ministry of Defence. Dated 13th of January 1981, it would be titled Unexplained Lights, and signed by Lieutenant Colonel Halt himself. In measured, detached language, it would describe the discovery of 3 depressions in the ground and elevated radiation readings, along with sightings of red and blue lights observed through the trees. The memo would make no mention of craft, beings, or any theory beyond those bare facts. But even so, its implications were extraordinary. For Penniston and Burroughs, the morning's investigation marked a turning point. In interviews years later, both men described a lingering sense of unease. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when reality itself begins to bend. "I kept thinking," Burroughs recalled, "if this wasn't from here, then someone somewhere already knew about it." British tabloids would later distort the story, labeling it Britain's Roswell. But inside the base, the atmosphere was less sensational, more tense, procedural, and quietly unsettled. Every word in every report mattered. Every measurement was double-checked, rephrased, and coded in bureaucratic neutrality. That night, as Penniston walked once more through the forest alone, the wind had shifted. He could still see the faint impressions in the soil, now crusted with frost. He kneeled down and placed his hand on the ground, cold, still. Yet in the stillness he felt something else, a residue of the event, the hum that had seemed to vibrate through his body the night before. When he returned to his quarters, he sat for a long time before opening his notebook. The sketches he had made of the triangular markings, the strange glyphs on the craft's surface, seemed almost foreign to him now, as though they'd been drawn by someone else. Across the Atlantic in Washington, the official correspondence would take weeks to circulate. By the time the Unexplained Lights memo reached the Ministry of Defense, it was already labeled non-threatening. The case, at least on paper, was closed, but out in the Suffolk countryside, farmers still spoke of strange lights over the trees that winter. And deep within Rendlesham Forest, 3 shallow indentations remained, slowly filling with frost and time, the last silent traces of something that had come and gone without explanation, leaving behind only questions written in the language of precision and disbelief. That morning's investigation, brief and clinical, would become the foundation of a mystery that still refuses to fade. By the evening of December 27, 1980, the tension inside RAF Woodbridge had grown thicker than the fog that rolled in from the Suffolk coast. The forest beyond the base, normally a quiet sea of pine and silence, now seemed alive with rumor. Whispers of strange lights and something landed passed from one shift to another. Yet few could imagine that night would bring an encounter even stranger than the first. Lieutenant Colonel Charles the Thirster Halt, the deputy base commander, had not intended to become personally involved. He was a man of discipline and detail, not given to speculation or superstition, but by late afternoon, reports of renewed activity in Rendlesham Forest reached his desk. A patrol had seen glowing lights again, not in the sky this time, but moving between the trees. The colonel decided it was time to see for himself. Just before midnight, Halt assembled a small team of security personnel and technical specialists. They carried Geiger counters, cameras, and radios, standard tools for field investigation, though none were designed for what they would soon encounter. The group moved out quietly through the east gate and into the forest, their flashlights slicing through the mist. From the start, something felt wrong. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with a faint static charge. Their radio channels crackled with intermittent interference. Even the animals, usually restless at night, had gone silent. Halt dictated his observations into a handheld recorder, a habit born of military procedure, but one that would, decades later, make his account one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence in UFO history. 3 a.m., his calm voice reported over the soft crunch of boots on frozen soil. We're approaching the area where the lights were seen. Noticed a strange pulsating glow, appears about 10 degrees off the horizon. Moving through the trees, what they saw next would remain burned into memory. Between the trunks, a small light, red, pulsing rhythmically, floated just above the forest floor. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, weaving between the trees as though aware of being watched. Each time someone tried to approach, the object seemed to retreat, keeping its distance, hovering with a fluid grace that no known aircraft could match. One of the men muttered under his breath, "Sir, that's not a beacon. It's moving." Halt ordered the team to fan out and keep it in sight. The light continued its strange dance, occasionally splitting into multiple points, then merging again. Through his binoculars, Halt described it as like a red eye dripping molten metal, glowing against the black backdrop of the forest. When it moved behind a tree trunk, the entire forest seemed to shimmer faintly, a ripple of energy, almost imperceptible but undeniably there. At one point, they noticed beams of light shooting down from the object toward the ground. "Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground," Halt's voice recorded steadily. "This is unreal." The beams were narrow, concentrated and silent, not like searchlights, but focused columns that flickered in place before vanishing. They followed the phenomenon across a field toward a nearby farmhouse. As they emerged from the trees, the men saw 3 lights now hovering in the distance, arranged in a perfect triangle. One was blue-white, another amber, the third red. Each pulsated rhythmically, maintaining formation. Through his binoculars, Halt saw that the central light appeared to be emitting smaller flashes, like sparks. Then suddenly a narrow beam shot from one of the lights directly down toward the ground, near their position. It was bright, pure white, sharply defined, and lasted only a few seconds. "Now it's shining a beam down right where we are," Halt's voice recorded, his tone still controlled but tinged with disbelief. The beam made no sound, no heat, no visible impact. Only a brief, intense illumination before fading into the mist. For nearly an hour, the men watched the lights shift and maneuver silently above the forest. Each time they thought the display had ended, another movement, another pulse would appear, as if the phenomenon was aware of their observation, performing just beyond the limits of comprehension. Around 4 a.m., the light slowly receded into the distance, disappearing over the tree line toward the coast. The forest fell silent once more, leaving only the whisper of wind and the faint buzz of radio static. Back at the base, Halt and his team logged their observations. Radiation readings were again elevated in specific areas, particularly near the sites where the beams had struck. Trees in those locations showed signs of heat exposure, though no physical damage or burn marks consistent with conventional fire. The airmen were shaken but professional. Halt knew that the report, once written, would need to pass through several layers of command. His handwritten memo, later titled Unexplained Lights, was concise, factual, and stripped of speculation. It described unidentified lights that appeared to maneuver intelligently and beams descending to the ground. He included sketches of the triangular light formation and noted that the event lasted approximately 2 to 3 hours. The report was forwarded to the Ministry of Defense, where it was classified under low defense significance. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, it was anything but. In the days following the second encounter, rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed strange electromagnetic interference had disrupted the base's radar systems that night. Others spoke of a sudden appearance of unidentified aircraft on radar screens, there one moment, gone the next. There were even whispers among local villagers of lights hovering silently over the forest edge, visible from miles away. For Halt, the experience left a deep impression. He had gone into the forest a skeptic, intent on documenting and debunking what he assumed were misidentified lights or a practical joke. He came out convinced that something beyond human understanding had taken place. In later interviews, he would insist this was no lighthouse, this was under intelligent control. Skeptics would later argue that the Orfordness lighthouse, visible several miles away, and had been mistaken for a UFO, but those who were there that night dismissed that explanation. The beams, the movements, the silent descent, none of it fit the simple pattern of reflected light. Over 40 years later, the Halt Tape remains one of the most compelling pieces of first-hand UFO evidence ever recorded. A real-time narration of a military officer witnessing something that defied the laws of known physics. That night in Rendlesham Forest did not end the mystery, it deepened it. What began as strange lights became an event woven into the history of UFO encounters, whispered across decades, analyzed in documentaries, and studied by investigators who still cannot explain what those men saw. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. In the cold silence of that English forest, for a few hours on that winter night, something watched back. By the dawn of December 28, 1980, the mist that had cloaked Rendlesham Forest for 3 nights began to lift, but the mystery only grew thicker. What had started as a strange sighting by security airmen had escalated into a full-scale investigation led by one of the base's highest-ranking officers. Now, after 2 consecutive nights of unexplained lights, physical impressions and beams that seemed to pierce the earth itself, the United States Air Force personnel stationed at RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge found themselves caught between protocol and the unexplainable. The official stance was simple. Nothing extraordinary had occurred, but inside the base, a quiet unease spread through the ranks. Men who had been trained to confront Soviet bombers and Cold War threats now whispered of something else, something that didn't fit the known world. When daylight returned to Rendlesham Forest, a team was dispatched to re-examine the landing site, first reported by Sergeant Jim Penniston and Airman John Burroughs 2 days prior. The air was crisp and silent, carrying only the faint smell of resin from the pine trees. The small clearing where the mysterious object had supposedly landed was still visible. 3 evenly spaced indentations in the frozen soil, each roughly the same size and depth, arranged in a perfect triangle. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. And then came something more perplexing, the radiation readings. Using standard issue AN/PDR-27 Geiger counters, the investigation team recorded radiation levels far above the forest's natural background. The ground between the impressions showed counts 10 times higher than average. Nearby trees displayed similar spikes, especially on the sides facing the clearing, as if something had emitted energy directly toward them. The bark, though unburned, appeared to glisten faintly, as though coated in a thin, translucent film. Colonel Halt reviewed the data later that morning. He was methodical, precise, but even he couldn't reconcile the numbers with any known explanation. It wasn't enough to claim danger, yet it was far beyond coincidence. At the same time, local civilians began reporting unusual activity. A farmer living on the forest's edge claimed his animals had been agitated and restless both nights, refusing to settle even when the lights disappeared. Another villager swore he saw something bright rise up through the trees and vanish into the clouds. To many, these were mere anecdotes, but to those who'd been in the forest, they sounded like confirmation. Behind closed doors, a quiet tension unfolded among the American officers. Officially, the Rendlesham events had to be logged as a routine security matter, nothing more. The Cold War was in full swing, and any talk of unidentified flying objects could easily be interpreted as Soviet intrusion or, worse, psychological warfare. But within the confines of the officers' club, the story spread like wildfire. "You wouldn't believe what Halt's men saw," one airman whispered over his drink. "Lights split apart, beams from the sky. They've got it all on tape." Another nodded, lowering his voice. "It wasn't just lights, friend. They said something landed." By the afternoon, Halt's memo had begun its journey up the chain of command. Titled simply, "Unexplained Lights." The document summarized the events in cold military language. It was factual, unemotional, and brief. Yet even in its restraint, it suggested the extraordinary. "Sightings of unexplained lights in the Rendlesham Forest area," it read, "accompanied by radiation readings and apparent impressions on the ground." The memo reached the Ministry of Defence in London within days. The response was cautious but dismissive. The incident was of no defence significance. That single phrase, used repeatedly in British UFO reports of the era, effectively buried the matter. Official investigation ended there. Unofficially, it had just begun. Among the American personnel, questions persisted. Could it have been a secret British test aircraft? A downed satellite? Experimental radar interference? None of those explanations fit the silent descent, the hovering lights or the radiation traces. And then there were the beams, recorded on tape by Halt himself, descending to the very spot where the men stood. By early January 1981, word had leaked to the British press. The News of the World ran a headline that caught immediate attention. "UFO lands in Suffolk and that's official." The story quoted anonymous airmen from the base, describing a glowing metallic craft and strange markings in the ground. Within days, reporters descended on the quiet villages surrounding Bentwaters, demanding answers that no one could confidently give. Halt, meanwhile, found himself reluctantly in the spotlight. As one of the few senior officers to witness the lights firsthand, his calm, detailed report became the cornerstone of what journalists now call Britain's Roswell. Decades later, his tape would be publicly released, revealing his steady voice describing the phenomena in real time. There was no hysteria, no exaggeration, just professional observation and disbelief, layered beneath military discipline. Even skeptics found it difficult to dismiss the Halt tape. The recording captured the sound of the men, breathing heavily in the cold, their radios crackling, and Halt's repeated efforts to quantify what he was seeing. "There it is again," his voice says at one point, firm but bewildered. "It's coming this way now, about 1,000 feet out." It stopped again. Years later, Halt would reflect on the experience with characteristic precision. "I didn't believe in UFOs before. I wasn't interested in them. But what I saw, what I measured, what I recorded, it was real. Something was in that forest. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a simple security patrol had become one of the most well-documented UFO encounters in modern history, an event recorded by multiple witnesses, supported by physical evidence, and corroborated by real-time audio. Still, for all the data, the Rendlesham incident remained beyond explanation. It did not fit into the clean logic of Cold War intelligence, nor the neat boxes of science or superstition. It was an encounter that lived in the narrow space between possibility and disbelief. A mystery witnessed by professionals who had been trained to see through illusions. In the aftermath, the forest returned to its quiet rhythms. The trees grew tall again, the soil absorbed the winter frost, and the marks slowly faded from the earth. But in the minds of those who were there, the images never disappeared. Beams descending in silence, a craft or something like it, hovering just beyond comprehension, and a feeling that the world had momentarily lifted its curtain to reveal something we were not meant to see. Rendlesham was no longer just a patch of English woodland. It had become a threshold between the known and the unknown, the explainable and the extraordinary. And even after decades of denials, that threshold has never quite closed. In the weeks following the Rendlesham Forest sightings, the official silence grew heavier than the mist that had once cloaked the woods. The US Air Force at RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge had done what military organizations do best: contain, document, and classify. But despite their efforts, rumors seeped through the base fences and into British newspapers. For the Ministry of Defense, this was no longer a forest mystery. It was a matter of reputation, control, and Cold War optics. When Colonel Charles Halt's Unexplained Lights memo reached London, it landed on the desk of a ministry official accustomed to filtering the strange from the strategic. UFO reports were not uncommon in the late 20th century. Britain had catalogued hundreds of them since the 1950s. But this one was different. It involved senior US military personnel stationed on British soil, radiation measurements, and, most alarmingly, audio evidence. It could not be ignored, yet the MOD's response was calculated. They concluded, at least publicly, that the incident was of no defense significance. That phrase, polished and deliberate, was bureaucratic shorthand for dismissal. It meant that no further investigation was deemed necessary, that no threat to national security was perceived, and that the matter could be quietly closed. Behind closed doors, however, the tone was less certain. Analysts within the Defense Intelligence Staff reviewed Halt's memo and found inconsistencies difficult to dismiss. The precision of the radiation readings and the credibility of the witnesses did not fit the profile of hysteria or misidentification. Still, to admit that something unidentified had breached the airspace above 2 NATO bases during the height of the Cold War was politically unacceptable. Silence was safer than speculation. The American command at Bentwaters faced its own dilemma. Men under their authority had reported, and in some cases physically interacted with, an unknown craft. To question their accounts outright would undermine morale and credibility. To confirm them would invite international scrutiny. So the leadership chose a third path: containment through classification. Reports were filed, statements were gathered, hand access to the forest was restricted. But what they couldn't contain were the witnesses themselves. Sergeant Jim Penniston, the man who claimed to have approached the craft on the first night, began to suffer recurring dreams, patterns of light and symbols replaying endlessly in his mind. In later interviews, he described the surface of the object as smooth, metallic, and covered in hieroglyph-like markings. He maintained that when he placed his hand upon it, he felt a pulse, like static electricity, alive under the skin. He wrote down the symbols in his notebook. Careful to document every curve and line, Airman John Burroughs, who had accompanied Penniston that night, later reported physical after effects: burns, temporary vision loss, and a feeling of exhaustion that lingered for days. Years later, declassified medical files would reveal evidence of tissue damage consistent with exposure to ionizing radiation, a fact that reignited controversy over what exactly the men had encountered. For the next decade, both men would find themselves at the center of competing narratives. Skeptics claimed they had seen nothing more than the Orford Ness lighthouse visible through the trees on a clear night. Others suggested a misidentified fireball, a local prank, or even psychological stress brought on by long hours and Cold War paranoia. Yet these explanations failed to align with the details. The craft had been observed at close range, at ground level, and had left behind physical evidence that could not be brushed aside. The most compelling contradiction came from radar records. Civilian radar operators in the region later confirmed that unidentified blips had been detected during the same time period as the sightings, objects moving at unusual speeds and altitudes. While these reports were never officially linked to the Rendlesham event, they added an extra layer of unease to an already strange episode. In 1983, the story broke into the public domain when a British tabloid published details of the Halt memo under the headline "UFO lands in Suffolk, and that's official." For the first time, the Rendlesham Forest Incident entered popular culture. It became Britain's answer to Roswell, not because of recovered wreckage or government confessions, but because it had all the elements of an authentic military encounter: trained observers, documentation, and physical traces. The MOD attempted to reassert control through press statements, reiterating that no credible threat had been identified. But the public's fascination only grew. Civilian UFO researchers filed Freedom of Information requests, uncovering years of correspondence and internal memos. What emerged was not a cover-up in the cinematic sense, but something more subtle: a pattern of bureaucratic deflection. The ministry had not lied. It had simply refused to ask further questions. Meanwhile, Colonel Halt, now retired, found himself drawn back into the mystery. In interviews decades later, his stance had hardened from cautious skepticism to quiet conviction. "I saw beams of light come down into the weapons storage area," he stated in one BBC interview. "It was under intelligent control. It wasn't the lighthouse, and it wasn't anything we were flying at the time." His statement carried weight. This was not a civilian enthusiast or a fringe theorist. This was a career officer, level-headed and disciplined. His words reopened old files and forced new ones into existence. In 2009, the Ministry of Defense officially closed its UFO desk, claiming that further reports would no longer be investigated. By then, Rendlesham had become a cultural landmark, the forest a pilgrimage site for researchers, skeptics, and believers alike. A trail now runs through the woods, marked by a metal sculpture shaped like the triangular craft Penniston described. It stands quietly among the trees, gleaming faintly when the sun hits it just right, a memorial not to aliens, but to unanswered questions. For the men who were there, the experience never faded. Penniston and Burroughs continued to seek official acknowledgement, their testimonies unchanged even after decades. In 2015, after years of appeals, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs recognized Burroughs' injuries as service-related, an unprecedented move that indirectly validated the physical impact of whatever occurred in that forest, the Rendlesham Forest Incident. Remains a paradox, a case too detailed to dismiss yet too elusive to confirm. It exists in that liminal space between national security and the unknown, where truth becomes a matter of classification and memory. And for those who stood under that silent sky, watching the beams of light move through the trees, it was never just a story. It was a moment when their training, their logic, and their understanding of the world failed them, leaving only one lingering question, one they still cannot answer. What landed in Rendlesham Forest? December 26, 1980, had already left an indelible mark on the men of the 81st Security Police Squadron stationed at RAF Woodbridge. But as darkness fell again over Rendlesham Forest, a sense of anticipation hung thick in the cold Suffolk air. The prior night's events, the hovering lights, the triangular impressions, the blinding flash, had left the witnesses unsettled, their rationality challenged by something they could neither explain nor fully comprehend. Now returning to the forest, the very trees seemed alive with expectation. Every rustle of pine needles and every whisper of wind carried a tension that tightened the chest. It was as if the forest itself had become a stage, awaiting the arrival of an audience that had already been chosen. Sergeant Jim Penniston led the patrol once more, boots crunching against frost-hardened soil. His flashlight offered his own instruction. The men had learned from experience. Light attracts attention. Their eyes adjusted to the dim shadows, the silhouettes of trees stretching like silent sentinels into the blackness. The air seemed charged, almost electrically so, carrying an invisible hum that made the hair on their arms bristle. Penniston could feel it under his skin, a subtle vibration that seemed to resonate with the heartbeat of the forest itself. Every trained muscle and instinct screamed caution, but a deeper, almost irresistible curiosity pushed them forward. They were moving not just into the forest, but into a space where the ordinary rules of perception no longer applied. The first sight of the lights that night was subtle, almost hesitant, yet impossible to ignore. Between the trunks, a reddish glow pulsed intermittently, casting elongated shadows across the frost. It moved with purpose, yet not with the patterns known to terrestrial technology. It drifted low, weaving around trees, disappearing and reappearing with a fluidity that made the mind grasp for familiar reference points: the blink of a lantern, the reflection of a distant lamp, the glow of a distant fire, all of which failed to explain what they were seeing. The men had been trained to assess threat with precision, identify, measure, classify. But this defied all categories. It was alive in movement, deliberate in action, yet utterly silent, untouched by gravity as it navigated between branches and trunks. Penniston felt his pulse quicken. It was one thing to read about unidentified aerial phenomena, another entirely to feel observed by something that seemed aware of your presence. Each time the men shifted their positions, the lights responded, retreating just enough to maintain distance, hovering again when the movement stopped. There was no mechanical sound, no air displacement, no hint of propulsion. The behavior suggested intelligence, a deliberate awareness, a responsiveness that transformed the forest from a passive backdrop into an active participant in this enigmatic encounter. "It's watching us," whispered one airman, barely audible over the soft crunch of frost. And somehow that statement contained the truth they could not deny. The unseen observer did more than hover. Occasionally the lights split, multiplying briefly into smaller orbs before recombining into the original shape. The pulsations seemed almost communicative, a subtle language of illumination, rhythmic and precise. Penniston, trained to notice patterns, could not make sense of it. The triangles of light, the timing of the pulses, the split and merge, all indicated an order, a structure, a consciousness operating on a level beyond human understanding. Every instinctive judgment he had relied upon as a soldier, every algorithm for assessing potential threats, faltered in the presence of this calculated display. He could see his team mirroring his hesitation, their movements cautious, almost reverent. As they advanced deeper into the forest, they encountered another anomaly, a brief illumination, a narrow beam of white light descending from one of the floating objects directly toward the ground. Penniston froze. The beam touched the earth without burning, without impact, yet it seemed to create a subtle ripple in the air itself. The frost around the beam glistened differently, charged with an energy he could not name. It was as if the observer had acknowledged their presence in a tangible, almost intimate way, signaling with light a connection that was impossible to explain. He realized then that they were not just witnessing an event. They were participants, drawn into a phenomenon that blurred the line between observation and interaction. The feeling of being watched extended beyond the lights themselves. The forest seemed to respond, the atmosphere thickening, carrying the faint tang of ozone and a subtle metallic scent. Animals, sensitive to disturbances unseen by humans, were restless even at a distance. Dogs barked, cattle stirred, and birds fell silent, their instincts recognizing a presence invisible to the human eye. For the men, the stillness that followed the light's movement was almost more unsettling than the lights themselves. It was the consciousness of the forest, an awareness that mirrored the intelligence in the hovering objects, a shared observation of their every action. Time lost its conventional meaning. Minutes stretched into hours. The forest became a liminal space, where conventional rules no longer applied. Penniston could feel a pressure in the chest, a subtle weight of being considered, analyzed, measured. He recalled later how the sensation was more than fear. It was the quiet, undeniable awareness of intelligence, an unseen observer capable of understanding their every move. He and his colleagues were no longer simply patrolling the woods. They were intruding upon a domain that existed beyond earthly comprehension, where each action was noted, each movement responded to, and every decision was silently judged. By the time the lights receded, fading into the night sky toward the eastern horizon, the men were left in a profound, unsettling silence. The forest returned to its ordinary rhythm. The frost settled, the air stilled, yet the sensation of observation lingered. It had been a presence not seen, yet undeniable. Every footprint they left in the snow, every leaf disturbed, every whispered word had been witnessed. For those men, trained to confront the unexpected with protocol and procedure, the experience shattered assumptions. The observer did not need to be seen to be present, and intelligence did not need a face to command attention. Even decades later, Penniston would describe the sensation of being watched as the most enduring memory of Rendlesham Forest, a presence that challenged human perception and demanded acknowledgement. It was not merely the lights, the impressions, or the radiation that made the event unforgettable. It was the understanding that some awareness had been there, unseen, scrutinizing, and ultimately unknowable. The unseen observer of Rendlesham Forest had left its mark not in physical traces alone, but in the consciousness of those who had stood beneath its silent gaze, forever altering their sense of what could exist beyond the familiar world. Decades later, the Rendlesham Forest Incident remains Britain's most famous UFO encounter, a Cold War mystery where trained soldiers, bound by discipline and secrecy, met something that defied both explanation and expectation. The forest, once a quiet patch of Suffolk woodland, has become a threshold between the known and the unknown, a place where evidence, memory, and the unexplainable converge. Triangular impressions in the soil, traces of radiation, and the testimonies of men like Penniston and Burroughs serve as silent witnesses to an event that continues to challenge logic. Official files may dismiss it, and skeptics may search for mundane explanations, but for those who stood beneath the beams of pulsing lights, the encounter was undeniable. It was a moment when the boundaries of reality shifted, if only briefly, and the world revealed itself to be larger, stranger, and more mysterious than anyone could fully comprehend. Rendlesham Forest is no longer just trees and frost. It is a reminder that the unknown can touch the lives of even the most trained, disciplined, and skeptical. And though the lights vanished into the night over 40 years ago, the questions they left behind, and the sense of being observed by something beyond our understanding, linger, refusing to fade. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some truths exist only in the quiet electric hum of a forest, in the pulse of light that defies reason, and in the memories of those who dared to witness what lay beyond the edge of human comprehension. What landed in Rendlesham Forest may never be known, but its presence, fleeting yet undeniable, continues to haunt the imagination, a silent testament to the possibility that, in the cold shadows of the Suffolk trees, we are not alone.